Hi everyone, my name is Julos Campano and this video is going to be about the discussion of nervous system and its influence in thermal regulation. I'm going to talk about homeostasis, temperature regulation, and a brief discussion of internal regulation and thirst and hunger. Let's start!
Homeostasis is the ability to maintain a constant internal environment in response to environmental changes. What kind of things needs to be kept constant in our body? It is very important to keep our body temperature same at around 37 degrees Celsius. We also need to keep the levels of sugar in the blood constant along with the levels of ions and water. Your blood pressure needs to be carefully monitored along with the amounts of waste in the blood such as carbon dioxide and urea. So let's say one of these is either high or low. What is the brain going to do to get back to the normal levels? The answer to that is negative feedback. Negative feedback is the process where the brain uses either hormone or nervous system to send a signal to the part of the body that can rectify the problem or that can reduce discrepancies from the set point or level. For example, after you eat meal, your blood sugar level increases. This is detected and the pancreas will release a hormone called insulin that causes the sugar to be stored in the liver. Therefore, the blood sugar level returns normal. Negative feedback is to leave the body detects the stimulus, reacts by the responding accordingly, and brings the body back to the normal levels. So why is homeostasis very important? Our metabolism, which is all the chemical reactions in our bodies that keep us alive, is controlled by enzymes. These enzymes are only working very specific conditions. If these conditions change, they could stop working and we could die. Luckily, all this happens without you having to think about it. Allostasis is the adaptive way in which the body changes its set points depending on the situation. We humans are endotherms. This means we are warm-blooded. We keep our body operating at 37 degrees Celsius regardless of the external conditions. However, this is a real challenge as our environment changes all the time depending on the weather, our clothes, if we are by the fire or outside in a cold night. So how does this work? It's quite similar to the heating and cooling system in a house. In a house is a thermostat that measures the temperature. Someone sets the minimum and maximum temperatures on the thermostat. If the house gets cold or the temperature drops below the minimum, the thermostat will tell the radiators to turn on and heat it up. If it is too hot or rises above the maximum, they will be told to switch off and turns on the air conditioner. Amphibians, reptiles, and most fish are poikilothermic. Their body temperature matches the temperature of their environment. They lack physiological mechanisms of temperature regulation such as shivering and sweating. People often apply the term cold-blooded, but that term is misleading because poikilothermic animals can remain warm most of the day by choosing an appropriate location. A desert lizard moves between sunny areas, shady areas, and burrows to maintain a nearly steady, fairly high body temperature at most times. Homeothermic animals, specifically mammals and birds, use physiological mechanisms to maintain a nearly constant body temperature despite changes in the temperature of the environment. Homeothermic animals use both behavioral and physiological mechanisms to control body temperature. To cool ourselves when the air is warmer than body temperature, we have only one physiological mechanism, which is sweating. Species that don't sweat will instead pant or leak themselves. Sweating, panting, or leaking exposes water, which cools the body as it evaporates.
In your brain is a special area called the hypothalamus. It measures the temperature of the blood flowing through it and collects information from temperature sensors around the body. It then decides if the temperature is too hot or too cold and bring it back to 37 degrees Celsius. If you are too hot, the hypothalamus then sends signals out of the body via the nervous system that can cause various effects.
We have several physiological mechanisms to increase body heat in a cold environment. One is shivering. Any muscle contractions, such as those of shivering, generate heat. Second, decreased blood flow to the skin prevents the blood from cooling before it reaches the brain, heart, other organs, and muscles. A third mechanism works well for most mammals, though not humans. They fluff out their fur to increase insulation. We humans also fluff out our fur by erecting the tiny hairs on our skin, which are called goosebumps. Another effect you may have noticed when you are cold are goose pimples. If you look more closely at these pimples, what you realize is that each of the little bump has a hair sticking out of it. These hairs are stood up to trap a layer of air around the skin, and air is a fantastic insulator of heat, and this will keep you warm and cozy. We also use behavioral mechanisms just as poikilothermic animals do. In fact, we prefer to rely on behavioral mechanisms when we can. The more we regulate our temperature behaviorally, the less we need to rely on energetically costly physiological efforts. Finding a cool place on a hot day is much better than sweating. Finding a warm place on a cold day is much smarter than shivering. Here are a few other behavioral mechanisms of temperature regulation. Put on more clothing or take it off. This human strategy accomplishes what other mammals accomplish by fluffing out or sleeking their fur. Become more active to get warmer or less active to avoid overheating. To get warm, huddle or cuddle with others. You might be shy about hugging strangers to keep warm, but many other species are not. For example, spectacled eiders spend their winters in the Arctic Ocean, which is mostly covered with ice. With more than 150,000 eiders crowded together, they not only keep one another warm but also maintain a 20-mile hole in the ice so they can dive for fish throughout the winter. Another example of it are the penguin chicks. A 1-month-old emperor penguin chick is poorly insulated against Antarctic temperatures that often drop below -30 degrees Celsius. However, when many chicks huddle together tightly, they act like one large, well-insulated organism. The cold ones on the outside push their way inward, and the warm ones on the inside passively drift outward. The process is so effective that a cluster of penguin chicks has to move frequently to prevent melting a hole in the ice. Water constitutes about 70% of the mammalian body. Because the concentration of chemicals in water determines the rate of all chemical reactions in the body, the water must be regulated within narrow limits. The body also needs enough fluid in the circulatory system to maintain normal blood pressure. People sometimes survive for weeks without food, but not without water. Different species have different strategies for maintaining the water they need. Beavers and other species that live in rivers or lakes drink plenty of water, eat moist foods, and excrete In contrast, gerbils and other desert animals may go through their entire lives without drinking. They gain enough water from their food, and they have many adaptations to avoid losing water, including the ability to excrete very dry feces and very concentrated urine. Unable to sweat, they avoid the heat of the day by burrowing under the ground. Their highly convoluted nasal passages minimize water loss when they exhale. We humans vary our strategy depending on circumstances. If you cannot find enough to drink, or if the water tastes bad, you conserve water by excreting more concentrated urine, decreasing your sweat, and other autonomic responses. In most cases, our strategy is closer to that of beavers. We drink more than we need and excrete the excess. However, if you drink extensively without eating, as many alcoholics do, you may excrete enough body salts to harm yourself. Most of our drinking is with meals or in social situations, and most people seldom experience intense thirst. We distinguish two types of thirst. Eating salty foods causes osmotic thirst, and losing fluids such as by bleeding or sweating induces hypovolemic thirst. So, I want to talk about the glucose, insulin, glucagon, and leptin because these are all important ways in which our hunger behavior is regulated. First, we'll start with glucose. Glucose is the main product of digestion. It is an important source of energy for the body. It is nearly the only fuel used by the brain. Insulin and glucagon regulate the flow of glucose into cells. Excess glucose enters the liver and fat cells. Next, insulin. Insulin is a pancreatic hormone that enables glucose to enter the cell. This is what happens after you eat a meal. Blood glucose levels fall. Then, insulin levels drop. Glucose enters cells more slowly. When hunger increases, then the pancreas releases glucagon. Type 1 diabetes is caused by the loss of cells producing insulin. That's why people with type 1 diabetes tend to gain weight. Third, glucagon levels. Hormone released by the pancreas when glucose levels fall. stimulates the liver to convert some of its stored glycogen to glucose to replenish low supplies in the blood. Last, leptin. Long-term hunger regulation is accomplished by the monitoring of fat supplies by the body. The body's fat cells produce the peptide leptin, which signals the brain to increase or decreases eating. Low levels of leptin increase hunger, and high levels reduce eating and increase physical and immune system activity. Another thing that I am going to talk about is eating disorders. Availability of tasty, high-calorie foods makes animals and humans obese, and they find other rewards less rewarding. Psychological distress does not cause weight gain. A high-fat diet before birth can result in the offspring being born with a larger than average lateral hypothalamus. Genetics and body weight. Thin parents tend to have thin children, and heavy parents tend to have heavy children. Obesity. Syndromal obesity. Obesity caused by a medical condition. Single gene mutations only account for 5% of cases of severe obesity. Most obesity relates to the combined influence of many genes and the environment. Weight loss. Dieting alone is rarely effective. Obesity often describes more as a deficit of activity than overeating. Increasing the activity and dietary changes which can be sustained are the keys to long-term weight loss. Bulimia and anorexia nervosa. Bulimia is an eating disorder in which people alternate between dieting and binges of overeating. Anorexia, extreme restricted eating. Both can be potentially fatal, and both can be related to body dysmorphic order.
Thank you for watching and listening. I hope you learned something from my discussion. Bye!